As many states across the nation took action in the last year to stop or limit the teaching of diverse history, Illinois took a bold step to become the first state to ensure that students in every public elementary and high school in Illinois learn about the contributions of Asian Americans to the economic, cultural, social, and political development of the United States. Hello, and thank you for joining us for our program celebrating the Illinois TEEACH Act, or Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History, at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I'm your moderator for today's program, Christina Shutt, Executive Director for the Library and Museum. Today, I'm joined by three individuals who have laid a foundation for cross-cultural education for Illinois students and are working to advance racial equity in the state. First up, joining me here at the ALPLM, Representative Jennifer Gong-Gershowitz. Representative, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you. So excited to be with you.
Wonderful to have you. Representative Jennifer Gong-Gershowitz has served as state representative of the 17th District in Illinois' General Assembly since 2019. The 17th District includes Evanston, Glenview, Gulf, Morton Grove, Northbrook, Skokie, and Wilmette. Before being elected to the State House, Representative Gong-Gershowitz worked as a lawyer focused on advocacy for immigrants, including victims of child trafficking and forced marriage. She served on the Illinois Unaccompanied Children's Task Force, where she encouraged the use of pro bono social workers to serve as guardians ad litem for children going through the immigration system. Representative Gong-Gershowitz was named the first Asian American to chair the House Judiciary Civil Committee in 2021 and also serves as the chair of the House Immigration and Human Rights Committee. She is a member of the House Asian American Caucus, Progressive Caucus, Green Caucus, and the Jewish Caucus. Next, we're joined by Christian Aldana. Christian, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Christina.
It's great to have you. Christian Aldana is the kinetic and youth organizer at Advancing Justice Chicago, and she is responsible for developing and implementing leadership and organizing programs for a diverse community of immigrant and refugee high school students in Chicago public schools. She has worked with young people across the Midwest and Southeast Asia to develop their leadership skills and equip them with the tools to create change in their communities. She has been a part of the Advancing Justice community since 2017 and currently organizes a Just Chi. And finally, we're joined with Noah Tang. Noah, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful today, thank you.
Noah Tang is in his third year as a world and American history teacher at Bloomington High School. Being a second-generation Chinese American, he infuses his family's story into the curriculum alongside the stories of many other Asian Americans throughout history. Mr. Tang wishes for each student to develop a personal connection to the past and claim a stake of our nation's history. I will also note that today, as we're filming this program, is on May 4th, which is the anniversary of the first Asian Pacific American Heritage Week, which was signed by President Jimmy Carter. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So, I want to start with maybe an understanding from each of you about kind of your own knowledge in history. So, you know, as a Black woman, I don't really remember learning much about Black history in schools at all. And when I think about Asian American history, I mean, I don't remember learning about that period in elementary or in high school. And so I'm curious about your experience with learning in school. Did you learn about Asian American history? Do you remember maybe the first time you were exposed to Asian American history in a public school environment?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because I think it illustrates why the TEEACH Act is so incredibly important. I am a graduate of Illinois Public Schools, and I knew nothing about Asian American history, and most notably knew nothing about how deep my own family's connection to that history had impacted not only my family's history, but my own. And so for me, this passing the TEEACH Act has been incredibly personal. I didn't know anything about the Chinese Exclusion Acts until I studied them in law school. Wow. And it wasn't until I started connecting the dots, filling in the missing pieces of my own family's story, that I discovered that my own grandparents fought deportation under the Chinese Exclusion Acts for over a decade. And so my hope is that the next generation will have the opportunity to see themselves in American history, because of course Asian American history is American history.
Absolutely.
And will have the opportunity to connect their own family's experiences, their own story, to the larger context of what it means to be an American. I didn't have that opportunity. I felt robbed of the opportunity to fully understand who I am in the context of American history, to connect my family's experience to the larger experience of what we know, contributes to what it means to be an American, which is a diverse experience. So for me, it has been incredibly gratifying to be a part of passing the TEEACH Act, because, to your point, I don't recall ever learning about Asian American history during the years in public education here in Illinois.
Wow. That's so powerful, especially to hear about your family's involvement and trying to resist and to fight the Chinese Exclusion Act. I love that. Noah, what about you?
I had a slightly different experience. I graduated my high school in 2015, so relatively recently. So the curriculum has been changing a little bit. I took AP U.S. history, so my curriculum was dictated by the College Board. So that curriculum is a little bit more advanced and inclusive than some other curriculums around the states. The experience was limited to, I would just say, Chinese rail workers, Chinese Exclusion Acts, and then Japanese internment. That's pretty much it. Most of it was just cramming for the AP test at the end of the year, but a little bit different from the representative's history.
I'm sort of struck by that and how limiting that almost is. And you get to learn a little bit, but you don't get to learn about the resistance piece of it, which seems like such a missing part of the story. Christian, what about you?
So I had a little bit of a different experience from both Noah and the representative, in that I went to high school in Asia, actually. But the odd thing about my education there is that I only learned European history the entire time that I was in a high school that was predominantly Asian, in an Asian country. So for me, it wasn't until college that I learned about Asian history or Asian American history. And even then, so I went to college in Ohio. And even then, most of what I learned about Asian American history was through extracurricular activities. So cultural clubs that I was part of, and leadership conferences that we would go to that were identity-based, like affinity spaces that did workshops about Asian American history. And though there was an Asian American studies minor at my school, in the field that I was studying at the time, which was political science, the only Asian American history related things that were offered at my school were all to do with, or well, rather, they were not to do with Asian Americans at all. It was all looking at foreign countries and how, those governments work. So we really had to do our own legwork, me and my peers, to learn about Asian American history.
Wow, it reminds me of this idea of the way in which history is often pushed to the margins or the sidelines, and made to be this sort of extracurricular activity, right, rather than as part of the regular course of study, which kind of leads us to really the TEEACH Act. And so, Representative, you were responsible for shepherding the TEEACH Act through the Illinois legislature. And a lot of people may not actually know about the first of its kind law here in the state. So could you tell our audience who may not be familiar with it a little bit about the TEEACH Act and what it does?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So the TEEACH Act, which, as you mentioned in your opening, stands for the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. the acronym itself says a lot about what we're trying to accomplish. You know, the goals here are to be inclusive, to try and portray the very diverse experiences of the Asian American community. The Asian American community is not a monolith. Asian American history consists of more than the Chinese Exclusion Acts, railroad workers, and Japanese internment. While all of those things are certainly defining, they are pivotal and they are important parts of our history, they're not the entirety. I think I read one study at one point that said in only 15% of textbooks were Asian Americans mentioned as change agents, which, you know, it is incredibly important for both Asian American students and non-Asian students in order to fully understand who we are as Americans, to have a more complete understanding of all the people who have contributed to it. And not to see only isolated incidents, but to have opportunities to learn about Asian Americans who were part of American history in a way, and I think you talked a little bit about the importance of contributions of Asian Americans to the fight for civil rights, for example. There are important stories to be told about how Asian Americans and others helped to really build what we now collectively experience as Americans. And so without that, what you're missing is a complete understanding of who we are. And I always say you can't possibly hope to do better or to understand your present unless you understand where you come from. Unless you understand our history, our collective history, both the good and the bad. How can we possibly hope to understand this moment, to understand one another, and to work together to build a brighter future for the next generation? So for me, the goal of the TEEACH Act is to teach a unit of Asian American history, and that unit, the intent of the bill is to be taught every single year, not just a passing reference or one unit that is, taught, one time and then you move on, but to be incorporated into lessons in an age-appropriate way throughout the course of education, so that Asian Americans are part of the learning that takes place in our classrooms.
Absolutely. I love that. I love what you've done, and it'll be really exciting to see as our school children start to incorporate this, and our teachers in the next year. So, you kind of touched on really my next question, which is that, Asian Americans are really often perceived as this kind of perpetual foreigner, despite having very deep community roots, many of which, predate 1776, right?
That's right.
It's not well known, for example, that the first Filipinos arrived on the continent of North America in 1587. So, Christian, maybe you could help us understand why Asian American history is so important, and maybe consider that with kind of three different audiences in mind, right? Teachers who will be watching this, as well as maybe students, and then in general, and then of course students of Asian American descent. So why is the teaching of Asian American history so important?
I think the representative mentioned in their previous answer, right, that knowing each other's history, our collective history, helps us understand one another. I work with young, predominantly students of color, predominantly Asian students of color, who talk to me about things that they experience on a daily basis at school, and have told me about some of the ways that they felt like they don't belong or felt like outsiders. And that has come from sometimes teachers, a lot of times their peers. And I think a lot about how, if we had been teaching this history all along, had been teaching inclusive history all along, that it would cut through some of the ignorances and the lack of empathy that they experience in their school environments. I think that as a teacher, and I'm sure Noah can speak to this too, is that you want to do right by your students. You want them to be engaged in your classroom. So if you have Asian American students in your classrooms, but you are not teaching content that they feel represented by that can really affect the way that they feel in your classroom and perhaps even the kind of work that they produce. And I think when it comes to also teaching, non-Asian students, I just can't help but think about how rich this history is, not just the history of Asian Americans, but other communities of color, and how much other students would be missing out on by not learning about this. And also, I think the kind of critical thinking skills that they don't get to develop when they're not able to have the opportunity to make connections between all of these different histories, right? And to see where they intersect and how they are similar, how they are different, how groups have contributed to the rich fabric of the country, and how different groups have also resisted and made change happen over time.
So Noah, what about you? How do you encourage other teachers to teach this history, to incorporate it in every aspect? We know that history isn't just limited to the history classroom, but is incorporated in government and English and all sorts of other disciplines. And so in what ways, how do you encourage those teachers?
Working with what is it called? We have interdisciplinary education, and I think that's highly important to cover. So in world history or American history classes, we would often work with English teachers, right? Aligning curriculum. So a great example would be a lot of memoirs from the Japanese internment. Right. We also do some local history as well. So not only with other teachers, but with community organizations such as the McLean County History Museum. Right. There's a very, very old and storied Chinese community in Bloomington, actually, the first immigrants coming over in the late 1800s. So really having opportunities to discuss with other teachers on how to get certain resources into their hands, because most of the part it's not out of disdain or hatred, right? It's they don't know, or they haven't been taught themselves, or they haven't seen these resources themselves. So I often provide them resources either in email or go over to their classrooms like, hey, are we teaching this? Or I think it's very key, and everything that Christian has already covered on. I think it's very important that students see themselves in the curriculum, right? I really do see it as a nation building activity when we are taking our own history. So yeah.
I love that terminology about nation building. That's powerful and weighty. We had a speaker a few weeks ago who wrote a book called Muslims in the Heartland, and he talked about sort of the Muslim roots that go back, particularly Arab Muslim roots that go back, 100 plus years. So it's another sort of group that's often seen as other or outside of the Midwest. I'm curious, especially as we've seen this really disturbing rise in anti-Asian violence and hate crimes in the last almost 3 years. Can teaching Asian American history be one way that we help to combat that violence and hatred?
Yeah, I always have felt that our best weapon against ignorance is education. You can't do better unless you know better. To me, an inclusive curriculum is fundamentally about building empathy, giving our students the opportunity to learn about one another. I think sometimes, when you don't have information, in the absence of information, what fills that gap are stereotypes, because you don't know any better. So this is really about filling in the gaps, about replacing false notions about who Asian Americans are with information about the diverse community that makes up our nation. And to Noah's point about nation building, the United States is the only nation on earth built on an idea. And so it is incumbent upon us in each generation to define what that means, to take American values to work together towards living up to those foundational values. And in my view, teaching an inclusive curriculum that encompasses all the people who make up America and have contributed to American history fundamentally is about building empathy, about building understanding, about building bridges where there are currently stereotypes. And I think that leads, I hope, to understanding and ultimately to combat hate, violence, and racism.
Yeah. You know, you echoed a little bit about this idea that, well, not even an idea, the reality, right, that Asian Americans are a diverse group of over 30 nationalities, right? It's one term for over 30, nationalities and groups and ethnicities. And obviously there are scores of differences among and within the group. Noah, I'd like to ask you, what recommendations might you have for teachers who may be watching and want to teach American history that really incorporates that diversity, that moves beyond just talking about a singular event in history, but talking about multiples?
Yeah, so I actually find it very interesting how Americans, right, white Americans interact with the Asian American community throughout American history, right? And we can actually delineate the differences because largely there is an ignorance throughout American history on which Asian is which Asian, right? One of my favorite images from history is right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We have a Chinese American woman on a beach with a huge Republic of China flag behind her. So people wouldn't accost her because they might think that she's Japanese, right? So when we get all of these different viewpoints into the history, right, we are not just saying, oh, all Asian Americans are the same. In fact, there are many wide experiences in the Asian American community in the United States, right? We have immigrants coming in here in 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, late 1900s. And we also have first generation immigrants and coming from different countries, from backgrounds. We have people escaping the Vietnam War. We have people coming out of China. My father in 1989, the student protests, right? So you have all of that rich history being able to be infused at various points in the chronology of American history. And I feel like when students see that, they not only get those Asian American histories, but they just see a wider understanding of history as a whole.
Christian, I'd like to ask you the same question. What recommendations might you have for teachers or even students who are looking to incorporate the diversity of Asian American perspectives?
So something that I've been talking to educators about as we've moved into like the implementation phase of the TEEACH Act is to think about what are the themes that they're focusing on throughout the year already, right? And then using that to guide what kind of examples or case studies that they may want to use from this incredible diverse breadth of Asian American experiences throughout our history. Like some of the things that no one named are definitely things you can incorporate into your curriculum. If you are teaching anything at all about the immigration history of this country, you have so much to pull from. And so I think that's what I would tell educators, is that those of us that are teaching history, that are teaching social science, are already equipped with the tools to select diverse material for their curriculums. It's just that this is perhaps new to some people because, as we know, if we had to pass this law to get it taught in our schools, that also means that it's not getting taught during teacher training courses, right? That Asian American history is not part of that. So I understand when educators might feel, some tension around incorporating something like this that feels brand new into their curriculums. But I want to, validate for them and remind them that they're already good teachers. They've been teaching history for years, and this is just another thing in their toolbox that they can pull from to make their classes richer and more inclusive.
So at the Lincoln Museum, we often encounter people who want to put Lincoln on a pedestal and say that Lincoln freed the slaves, or that Lincoln did everything by himself with no help from anybody else. And so I'm curious for each of you, what do you consider maybe a lesser known movement in Asian history, Asian American history, that is important to understanding American history ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a lawyer. So the kinds of things that I found fascinating when I was actually preparing to present the bill in committee, I didn't know that it was actually a Chinese American family that worked to desegregate California schools about 10 years before Brown versus Board of Education, in a case called Tate versus Hurley. It was a Chinese American student who was seeking admission to a segregated all-white California school. And that case went all the way up to the California Supreme Court, desegregating California schools. And that to me was incredibly affirming for me, that there was, that there was a Chinese American family also recognizing the need to desegregate our schools. That work was being done, not one case, that this was most likely part of a much larger conversation happening around the country. And as you said, understanding the breadth of those experiences and the actors who have been change agents throughout American history gives us a fuller understanding of what it takes, so that in this moment, we might not feel so disconnected to how change happens.
Christian, what about you?
I think the thing that has always stuck out to me, especially as a Filipino American, is the Delano Manong's story. So we might be familiar with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers Movement, and the historical strike that they went on. But what I didn't know until the past few years, and what I think many people don't know, is that actually it was Filipino farm workers that decided to strike. And what happened was Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz, who were both Filipino farm workers who had organized other farm workers in other parts of California prior to coming to the Delano Valley, approached Cesar Chavez and asked if the Mexican farm workers would go on strike with them, because they knew that if it was just the Filipino farm workers that went on strike, that their management would just, hire other farm workers of another ethnicity to fill that gap. So they went over to extend a hand of solidarity, to ask them, to do this risky, historic thing that eventually led to them winning, fair wages, fair hours for farm workers across California.
And Noah, what about you?
Well, she actually took mine, but I have another one.
Sorry, Noah.
The Filipino movement is actually a really good idea for solidarity between oppressed minorities in this country. Another great example I love to give out to my students during our Black Power unit is Yuri Kochiyama. Right, Malcolm X died in the arms of this Japanese American woman. Right, she was a wonderful activist in New York City, tied closely with Malcolm X and all of the other Black separatist and anti-war movements in the 1960s and 70s. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
I love that. I love, again, the echoes of the solidarity of movements to ultimately to change America and make it a better place. through each of those stories. So, as our final question, it's really interesting for me to see things that are so American. We kind of alluded to it a little bit in the last question as we expanded our idea about civil rights and who was involved in civil rights movement. And so I would love for each of you to maybe share with others something that seems so quote unquote American when we think about it, but really has heavy Asian influence. It has roots within the Asian American communities, and that it's because of that, right, that we call it American. So Noah, would you start us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to give an actually really interesting one that not that many people know, but when you think of a stereotypical Chinatown, right? San Francisco, right? Chicago's Chinatown. A lot of those were actually originally, right, actually immigrant communities. And when the San Francisco Chinatown burned down, they actually kind of rebuilt it with a more of a caricature type deal of a caricature of China, right? So when Americans go to Chinatown, right, they're like, oh, look, this is Chinese culture. But in fact, a lot of the buildings and the ornamental gates that you see over Chinatown is actually of a white American design. So when you do think about, oh, this is what it means to be Chinese American, sometimes lay people, when they see Chinatown, it's like, oh, I see this, I see that. But in actuality, this might just have been created. And I also find that extremely fascinating. Sometimes it's the other way around as well. And people played into this to improve their businesses.
Christian, how about you?
When I saw this question, I was having a hard time thinking of one, and I wasn't originally going to go with this because I thought, oh, maybe people know that, but actually, when I think about how little people know about Asian American history, maybe folks don't know. So the railroad that runs through our country that transports goods and people all over was built by African American folks and also Chinese American folks. And I think about how when I think of America and the infrastructure that supports it, right, I'm not often thinking about Asian Americans having built it, at least, in the past before I learned all the things that I learned now. And I remember when I learned that, I was like, oh, like we've been here a long time. We built the things that we are using every day, right, to live, to go about our lives, to conduct business. And that's so important. That's the foundation of this country.
Love it, foundational things. Representative, how about you?
Yeah, so, I think when I think about Asian American history, of course, I always think of my own family and the traditions that I grew up with and am familiar with. And I also think about my own family's experience, which is in some ways, I think very much consistent with the intersectionalities of other communities, immigrant communities throughout American history. And I think of, my grandparents, opening a small business and the small businesses that you see celebrated really throughout our nation. Often being started, these small businesses that become really the bedrocks of our communities, being started very often by families like my own. And what that has meant, that kind of innovation, that spirit of entrepreneurship being really very American. The idea that you, set up shop in your community, and those small businesses really then becoming woven into what we experience as Americans. In fact, when I travel around the world, what I always find odd to me is that the cuisine or the shops are all very similar. Because what I'm used to as an American is the diversity. You can have Thai one night and Italian the other night, and I have a favorite Ethiopian restaurant, and I mean that to me is familiar. that diversity. Something that I've come to, really appreciate about our communities. And that I think is such an enriching part of what makes us so unique. And while it can sometimes be challenging, our diversity is ultimately our strength. I mean, it is absolutely our strength. It's who we are. And when I think about my own family's experience, and I think about the fact that when my grandparents arrived in America as Chinese immigrants under the Chinese Exclusion Acts, they were by definition illegal under law. And here I am, just 2 generations later, a member of the Illinois General Assembly. I mean, that is an American story. That's an American story.
I love that. That's, the perfect way to end our program today. I want to thank Representative Gong-Gershowitz for being with us, as well as Christian Aldana and Noah Tang for joining us virtually. Remember, you can learn more about Asian American Pacific Islander History Month by visiting our website, presidentlincoln.illinois.gov. You'll see a whole host of other events we're doing, both virtual, hybrid, and in-person events. So we invite you to check our calendar of events there, as well as visit us on all social media platforms. Again, thank you all for being here today. I feel like I've learned lots that I didn't know before, but most importantly, I love what you said about the Asian American experience. The Asian American history is quintessentially American history. So thank you for joining us.